thanks for having me. Let me start my presentation. Here we go. Yeah, so this will be about the microfrontend revolution with module federation and Angular, saying this, everything I'm telling here is also important and possible with all the other frameworks. But you have to do things in addition to also make it work with Angular and its huge ecosystem. So let me start with a tiny drawing. Perhaps you know this drawing here. This is a helicopter which was designed 1400 something from Leonardo da Vinci. This guy invented a helicopter in 1400 something. It's unbelievable. The thing is, he only designed it. He didn't have the material to build it. But scientists have now the material to build it, and so they found out recently it would fly. If you would build it, then it would fly. And I really like this metaphor, because this is like the situation we have with micro-frontends. In the area of micro-frontends, we have a lot of good ideas, we have a good design, but so far we lacked the material for building it in a proper way. But this is changing now with module federation. But first of all, what do I mean when I use the word micro-frontend? Well, basically, I mean that you subdivide software system into tiny subdomains which are an application of its own. In this case, we have a little booking application, we have a little check-in application, luggage and boarding. Several tiny applications of a big one monolithic application. So why do we do this? Well, the main reason is we want to scale our teams. We want to make sure that one team can work in isolation on one of those software systems. So we can have little agile teams. They can really concentrate on their part and they don't need to coordinate with other teams. They just do their thing and they can provide business value on a regular basis without the need to coordinate with each other. They can even deploy separately without the need to coordinate. So this brings back a lot of agility, even though we have big software systems. Of course, having a lot of tiny systems is nice, but somehow the user wants to have one big integrated system. And that's why we need to find ways to load those tiny systems into something I would call a shell. In this case here we have a shell, it runs on localhost 5000, it has a menu, and on demand it loads this micro frontend from localhost 3000. And of course, we are not only doing this with one micro frontend, we are doing this with a whole bunch of micro frontends, loading them just on demand. And for this very strategy, you needed a lot of tricks in the past, a lot of dirty tricks. But now we have the proper materials, which is the case with the helicopter of Leonardo da Vinci, and this proper material is called module federation. It ships with Webpack 5 and it makes it really easy to load separately compiled, separately deployed source code into your shell. And this is what this whole talk is about. First of all, I will give you an overview of module federation. This is the same for each and every framework you are using. Then I will talk a bit about federated Angular. In the world of Angular, we have the CLI, and the CLI shields Webpack from us. So we need to do some tricks to make this work with Angular. If you are using React, or if you are using, let's say, Vue or Svelte, then you don't need these tricks, because in these cases you use Webpack directly. Here we use it indirectly. So we need to do some tricks. And at the end, I will show you a roadmap of a possible future. Okay, so before we get started, let me also introduce myself. I am Manfred. I'm a trainer and consultant for Angular. I'm helping a lot of companies with this topic. I am also quite connected to the Angular community. I live in Austria. I do a lot of stuff in Germany. And I'm always happy when I can work with people also in other countries, like, of course, Poland. Okay, let's get started with the first chapter. Let's talk about Webpack 5 and module federation. Well, the main question module federation is answering is this here. How to load separately compiled source code. And perhaps you are saying now, well, Manfred, come on, that cannot be that difficult because we have this import statement, and even before we had require, which did almost the same as import is doing. And why not use this statement to point to another application which we want to load dynamically at runtime? Well, the answer is, in theory, this works perfectly. In theory. In practice, this doesn't work at all with current tools like Webpack because all those tools assume that everything is in place at compile time. Everything needs to be there, everything needs to be known at build time. Everything is built together, everything is optimized together. Think on tree shaking, for instance, and only then this whole bunch is subdivided into chunks for lazy loading. But only then. And so this was not really possible in the past with modern tools like Webpack and co. And so it wasn't even possible with the Angular CLI, which is heavily leveraging Webpack. But now module federation is changing this. Module federation introduces two roles. The first role is the host. I'm calling it the shell. It's my microfrontend shell. The second role is the remote, which is the microfrontend in our case. In general, it is some plugin that is dynamically loaded at runtime. And now you can configure the host. You can configure it by defining an URL. You can say, hey host, I have this URL mfe1. Here it stands for microfrontend1. It's very repetitive, I know. And this URL points over there to this other application. And by the way, over there it's also called mfe1. That's the first step you need to do. Map a URL pointing to another application. Within the application you want to load, within the remote, you can expose stuff like a TypeScript file, a JavaScript file. Here in this case, I'm using a component. I'm exposing the component in this file and I'm assigning this name here. And now something beautiful happens. I assure you, you will love it. Now you can simply do an import using the mapped names of both sides, and this allows you to grab over there and to load the exposed stuff from over there. And the best thing of this is, Webpack is doing the heavy lifting underneath. Your framework, React, Vue, Angular, does not even notice that you are loading something that was separately compiled. It does not even notice. You are just doing lazy loading with a dynamic import, and the rest is done underneath by Webpack. And so, obviously, your favorite framework becomes your Meetup framework for loading this and that remote. Awesome. You don't need a separate framework for microfrontends anymore. So, of course, we need to get the URL of the microfrontend somehow. And for this, we need to construct a remote entry point on the side of the remote. This remote entry point is just a file emitted by Webpack. And this file, it's really a tiny one, several bytes, contains all the metadata we need in the shell. And one part of this metadata is the URL. There are all other metadata in there. So that means when compiling the microfrontend, we get the remote, and when starting the shell, we need to load the remote somehow. For loading this remote entry point, we have several options. You can reference it with a script tag, you can hard code it in your configuration, or you can go fully dynamic. You can fully dynamically load it at runtime just on demand. And as soon as you've loaded this remote entry with all the metadata, you can dynamically load the whole microfrontend. But there is even one thing that's better. Namely, you can share libraries. Let's say you are using Angular on this side and Angular on that side. In this case, you can define it a shared library, and that means it will only be loaded once. Let's say you have 10 microfrontends. You don't want to load React, Vue, or even Angular 10 times. You just want to load it one time and then share it among all the microfrontends. And that's the case here. I'm just saying, hey, share it. Saves you a lot of bandwidth. So everything I've told you so far holds true for all the frameworks. React, Vue, Svelte, and of course Angular. But as mentioned before, when using Angular, we need to do a little tiny trick to integrate it into the ecosystem. The thing is that the Angular CLI is using Webpack under the covers. That's great. This is really taking a lot of burden from us because Angular developers don't need to deal directly with Webpack. It is remote controlled by the CLI. But also the CLI is shielding Webpack from us. So we don't see it. And normally that's good. But now it's not that great because now we have a module federation config. And somehow we want to squeeze it into the configuration of the Webpack, which is shielded from us. So we need to find a way to provide it to Webpack behind the covers. And for this, there is an official solution in the world of Angular. It's called custom builders. The thing is, the Angular CLI is not directly compiling applications and libraries. It is delegating to builders. A builder is an exchangeable unit for building applications somehow. And of course, there is a default implementation. The default implementation for applications is just delegating to Webpack. But now we could create our own custom builder, which is delegating the federation config to Webpack. And then it could delegate to the traditional default builder so that it builds everything together with Webpack and our configuration. This is not a big deal. You could write it easily by hand, but you don't have to do it because I have already provided a plugin for this. It's called Angular Architects Module Federation. And it does three things for you. The first thing is it creates a skeleton for the module federation config. That means you don't need to learn everything by heart or to use snippets. It generates everything in there and you only need to command out what you need. That's the first thing. The second thing is it installs this custom builder which provides your configuration to Webpack underneath the covers. And the third thing is it assigns a new board for ngServe, so that we can serve two or several microfrontends side by side. The usage of this is, as I think, really drop dead simple. First of all, ng adds this to your application, then adjust the generated configuration, and then ngServe everything to try it out. And this is what I'm doing now. I will show you now a demonstration for it. Well, in this demonstration, I have here a shell, and here I have my microfrontend. It's, as I call it, red microfrontend. And when I'm clicking here to flights, you can guess what happens. When I'm clicking here, then nothing happens. Nothing happens. It only tells us not implemented yet, because this is our task now. Our task during this live coding part of this presentation. So let's get started with it. Let's switch over to my console. Here I have already prepared two windows, one for the shell, one for the microfrontend. Within the window for the shell, I'm saying ng add Angular Architects Module Federation. Should. Now I'm getting two questions. Now I should get two questions. Come on, boy. Installing, yeah, I should have a good cable to the internet. The first question is, what is your project name? And I'm saying, well, it's the shell. And the second question is, which board do you want to use? Well, let's go with 5000. And now everything is generated for us. The skeleton for the Webpack configuration, and also the Angular JSON is updated to respect the board, and also to respect the custom builder, which is squeezing in this Webpack configuration into the CLIs one. I'm doing the same over here. ng add Angular architects module vision should. And now it's one more time asks me of the project, it's MFE1, Microfrontend 1, and the board is 3000. And one more time, everything is generated in here. When we look into the source code of this, then we see within the backend that I'm already using Angular 11. It has been around for about a week, so it is really fresh and new. And the best thing is Angular CLI 11 allows you to opt in into Webpack 5. By default, it is still using Webpack 4 because it was heavily tested with 4. But you can opt in into Webpack 5 experimentally using this section here. This forces especially Jan to squeeze in Webpack 5 everywhere, even though if we've used the older version like Webpack 4. The thing is, this is only directly reset by Jan. There is an NPM package to make this work with NPM too, but out of the box you only get this with Jan, so install your dependencies with Jan and you are good. This is what you need to do in addition to make work with Angular. And as mentioned, if you use another framework, you don't need to focus on this, then just update to Webpack 5 and do what I'm doing now within this Webpack configuration. So now let's have a look to our... This is a mono repository for this of simplicity. It consists of our microfrontend and of our shell. If we look into the microfrontend, we see this Webpack config. In my case, it's only a partial Webpack config. The rest is generated by the CLI. If you're using a high-level framework like React or Vue, of course, you have very likely a full Webpack config here. And the most important part is here this module federation plugin. This is activating module federation. So for the remote, I'm uncommenting this here. This is about MFE1. This is the name of the microfront. This is the name of my remote entry point with all the metadata. And here I'm exposing a module. It's an Angular module. Flights.module. This is what I want to expose. It's basically a module with some subroutes. I don't need this section, this is only for hosts. So let's get rid of it. Also here, I'm saying, hey, I want to share this or that library. And the configuration here is a bit more complicated than the configuration on the slides. On the slides, we just had the names of the shared libraries. This is completely okay. But here I'm also specifying some additional behavior. With those two properties, I'm saying, please only load Angular once, even though there are different versions needed. Let's say one microfrontend needs Angular 8 and the other one needs Angular 10. In this case, even though we have several versions, we are just loading it once. And emit an error if this is the case. By default, we only get a warning. Something like, hey, we needed Angular 8 and 10, but we just loaded Angular 10 because we don't want to have Angular several times. By default, we get a warning. Here I'm very strict. Here I'm saying this is forbidden. No, I'm just loading Angular once and needed several versions. I'm emitting an error. Strict versions. Oh. Okay. So this here is the configuration of my micro frontend. Now let's go over to the shell. And here we have another Webpack configuration. And it looks the same. Basically a Webpack configuration using the module federation plugin. This is only needed for remote, so let's get rid of it. This is needed for hosts. So I'm saying, hey, I want to work with MFE1. It's also called MFE1 over there. And here you find the remote entry point. The remote entry point with all the metadata. And saying this, hard coding this, is only one option. You can do this mainly, I think you will do it for the sake of testing. There are other options, like doing it with a script tag in the index HTML, or you can go fully dynamic. You can use the Webpack runtime API. You can use some helper functions like loaded Webpack, and then you can at runtime just on demand load this remote entry point. It's also completely okay. Here I've decided to go with the simplest option, with the hard-coded one. Yeah, and obviously here I'm sharing the same stuff. Sharing is caring, as we know. Okay. Now we have configured our host, our shell. Of course, our host also has a routing configuration. So if we look into it here, app routes, we say I've already prepared a lazy route, which is grabbing there to the remote using this mapped URL MFE1 module. And from over there, the flight module is lazily loaded. This is really one of the best things of module federation, because this clearly shows our framework, Angular React Vue, becomes a meta framework. It is now capable of doing lazy loading, of reloading other separately compiled stuff. And it doesn't even know, because as mentioned, Webpack is doing the heavy lifting underneath. But TypeScript is a bit critical. TypeScript is saying, hey, I don't know this path here. What shall I do with this path? I don't know this file. And we can now say, okay, TypeScript, I know you don't know it. It doesn't exist at compile time, but trust us, we are experts. It will exist at runtime. Webpack will make sure this exists. And to make this happen, we need a DTS file. The name is not relevant. Just call it TDS, like declarations TDS, for instance. It will automatically be picked up by TypeScript. And here we can declare everything that does not exist at compile time, but everything we want to assure TypeScript will exist at runtime. We can even go with an asterisk here if we want to say, hey, everything starting with MFE1 will exist at runtime. Please believe us. If we look back, then we see it's fine for TypeScript now. Okay, so let me sum up. What did we do? We exposed a module within the remote. We configured the shell so that it points to the remote and so that it loads them from the remote at demand using lazy loading. Now let's try this out, because, you know, words are cheap. Let's try it out. So here, let me start my micro frontend one. And side by side, let's start the shell. We will get one or two warnings. You know, the Webpack 5 integration in the Angular CLI is currently experimental. This is one of the advantages you have with React and Co. You don't have that much ecosystem, I would say, official ecosystem. And if you use Webpack directly, you don't have issue. So everything is started. Let's jump in here. This is my micro frontend. This is my shell. And when we click here, hey, the Microfrontend is loaded on demand. I know, this really looks like loading, but it is far more than just lazy loading. Let me prove it when we look at the network tab when clicking here. Okay, I had a filter. If we look at the network tab when clicking here, we see this file is loaded on demand. Yeah, this is like lazy loading, but it only has 12K in debug mode. It would be a third in production mode. And this proves that Angular itself is shared, because Angular itself would be far bigger than just this. It is just loaded by the shell and then shared with the remote. And the best thing is, here this part comes from localhost 3000, and this part here comes from localhost 5000. Two different origins, and the source code provided by those origins meets on runtime. So we have a very dynamic scenario. Perhaps you are now wondering, well, what's the roadmap of this? When can we have it? The good answer is Webpack 5 is final, so you can directly start using it. Also CLI 11 is final, but in CLI 11 Webpack 5 is an experimental opt-in. That means if you try to implement something for the long term, you can get started with it. If you need to deploy in 3 months, then I would not use it now. In this case, I would just introduce this with CLI 12. But if you say, hey, I'm starting a project now and the first public release is in half a year or a year, then you can get started with it so that you can respect it within your overall architecture. And if you are not using Angular but the other framework, just use Webpack 5 directly and you are fine. If you like this topic, then you might also like my ebook. You can download it for free under this URL, angulararchitects.io/book. So let me come to a conclusion. What did we see today? We saw that module federation is really a nice thing. Somehow it is the missing material we need for building microfrontends. We've seen that it allows us to load separately deployed code, which was not really possible before, even though we had some workarounds. It was not possible without those dirty workarounds. We've seen this is really an enabler for microfrontends, but also for other plugin-based systems. And we've looked into federated Angular to get this bridge solution, this bridging solution between Webpack 5 on the one side, Angular on the other side, and your very module federation config. And one last thing. Now you have the chance to become the next Leonardo da Vinci. Now you can also implement your cool designs, which might or might not include module federation and microfrontends. If your design includes microfrontends, then I would encourage you to look into module federation. So be the next Leonardo now. Here you have my contact data. I've already uploaded my material, and if you want, follow me on Twitter so that we can stay in contact. Thanks for having me and have a nice day.